Welcome to our second panel in this conference on Buddhism, creativity, and art. We turn our focus now from visual art that we had in the first panel to auditory art, one could say, and explore language as art, that is poetry and chanting. I will host again this panel. That was my original panel to chair. Again, we are having the same procedure. I will present the speakers one by one. They will have their presentations for about 20 minutes. Then the panelists among themselves can ask questions and answer them. And we will go through this process 4 times. And at the very end, there will be opening of the audience for questions. That was the wrong way to say it, but you understand what I mean. Because in my mind, I was thinking, when are we going to have the break? After 1 hour, right? Okay, good. After 2 presenters. So let's start. Our first speaker today is Shireen Patell. Many of you know her, but I will present her anyway, introduce her anyway. Shireen is a literary and critical theorist with a specialization in trauma studies. She received her doctorate in comparative literature from the University of California, Berkeley, with a dissertation on Emmanuel Levinas and the ethics of interpretation. Before moving to Boulder in 2013 to study full-time at Rangjung Yeshe Institute, she taught at NYU for 12 years, New York University, where she was assistant professor and associate director of trauma and violence studies, an interdisciplinary master's program she co-founded. She has published essays on trauma in relation to mourning, national formation, racism, identity construction, pedagogy, writing, and film. She now devotes herself full-time, as best as she can, to Buddhist study and practice, and to service to Chögyam Rinpoche and Rinpoche's mandala activities. So today, Shireen will talk to us about Dharma art, non-aggression, and anti-racism. Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche meets poet Lucille Clifton. Give her a round of applause.
I don't want to stand on my tiptoes the whole time. Okay. Is that good, Dharma friends? Genuine art, Dharma art, is simply the activity of non-aggression, says Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche, CTR henceforth. When I first read this simple and profound teaching, it struck a chord of truth in me that's been reverberating in my mind for a long time. Yet in my work as a critical theorist specializing in trauma studies, I've immersed myself for decades in literature, both fictional and non-fictional, that cries with pain and rage, sings untold songs of suffering, poignant and wrathful, hot and cold, profound acts of language that also strike chords of truth. I wondered, can CTR's definition of genuine art, Dharma art, with its apparently peaceful expression of non-aggression, include and accommodate such works? How are the wisdom of the Buddha Dharma as non-aggression and the potency of art to respond to our traumatic histories of the present even, in ways that are productive and expansive, that help guide us beyond the dialectical swings or the circular patterns, whichever metaphor you prefer, the suffering of what Buddhists call samsara and what others identify as history repeating itself. Slide. US Buddhism is facing the particular challenges of inclusivity at a time when the structural racism and the violence of the very institutions that are meant to serve and protect can no longer be denied. I'm thinking about how the Black Lives Matter movement has broken to the forefront of US consciousness, whether to be contended with or denied, and has caused a kind of awakening, rude or one of grace, in all kinds of institutions, Dharma centers included. In her essay, Opening the Heart in Anti-Racism Activism, Pema Chodron and the Lodro Teachings, Judith Simmer Brown frames the issue like this. If we employ systemic analysis without Lodro, we miss the opportunity for spiritual transformation that the radical reframing of personal interest affords us? How can social justice activism be informed by technologies of spiritual transformation embedded in Tibetan Buddhism, and vice versa? Slide. I hope that staging an encounter between CTR and Lucille Clifton on the force of art, genuine art, Dharma art, can illuminate some of these difficult issues and ventilate the sometimes claustrophobic space of US Buddhism in this cultural moment. I don't know exactly how these themes play out in other contexts, European, Asian, African, and all other kinds of Dharma locations, but because of our indisputable interconnectedness, particularly in this time of globalization, I imagine that the tensions that give rise to these kind of questions make themselves felt in all kinds of places and ways in the contemporary Buddhist net. CTR and Clifton might not be as unlikely a pair as it may first appear. Two US poets, one could say, who devoted themselves to knowing the truth of suffering and alleviating it with their particular gifts. CTR had a special connection to the US, first arriving there in 1970, at a time when major cultural upheaval of the 60s was ongoing and just at the beginning of being integrated into US consciousness. Rinpoche is widely seen as the first Tibetan master to transplant Vajrayana into the US, and he had a keen understanding of Western, particularly US mind. In the preface to a work of his collected poetry, he explains, slide, this simple book of poetry presents evidence of how the Tibetan mind can tune into the Western mind. There's nothing extraordinary about this, but the important fact is that East and West can meet together, contradicting Kipling's verse, "Oh, East is East and West is West, and never the twain shall meet." Upon my arrival in the West, I felt strongly the meeting of the two minds, culturally, spiritually, metaphysically, could be realized by means of first thought, best thought, the uncontaminated first glimpse of one another. First thought, best thought turned out to be an important instruction for both meditation and artistic creation, because, as CTR explains, first thought is actually not a thought. It is what occurs in a state of freshness in a vast expanse, dynamic with possibility. First thought, best thought is what CTR characterizes as true perception. Whereas we might be conditioned to think that there are unbridgeable divides between people, true impasses in understanding, CTR taught us the Buddha Dharma as the possibility of relating to phenomena to one another with a first thought, best thought attitude. CTR identifies this kind of poetic disposition as a way of crossing a seemingly uncrossable divide, East meets West. He goes on to explain that this kind of disposition was not merely theoretical for him, but that poetry and the sonority of language itself were his actual entry points into understanding Western mind. Thus, when CTR arrived in the US, just as the 60s were chronologically ending, it was with this poetic understanding of true perception and the commitment to seeing reality as it is, both as inconceivable Dharmakaya and as extension, the realm of appearances, the possibility of our shared world. Slide. I am assuming that many of you may not be familiar with poet Lucille Clifton. She was a Black US poet born in 1936 in upstate New York, who left us almost 15 years ago, but with a legacy of poetry so potent that we have not yet begun to understand its full measure. Her oeuvre includes the personal and the political, ever intertwined, whether overtly or in the background, and her commitment to clear seeing might also be described as spiritual, because it required deep listening, courageous seeing, and is based on her outlook, quote, that poetry, almost more than anything else, shows us that everything is connected. Listen to how she describes herself as poet and the I and its stand-ins that appear in her work. My I tends to be both me, Lucille, and the me that stands for people who look like me, and the one that is also human. You know, I think if I distinguish anything, there's a distinction between what I look like on the outside and what somebody else does, and what we are on the inside. So it's me as the outside, and it's me as the inside. Understanding the construction of herself, her I, as the dynamic intersection of different stories and differential placements, Clifton writes from the place where everything is connected and shifting, where her multiple eyes are not only the signature of individual expression, but also a mouthpiece for history untold. She recounts a backhanded compliment from a listener who said that he liked her poetry, but he couldn't really get into it because he was into history. And I said, me too. She continues to the interviewer, you know, what I'm writing is also history, and some of it is the history of the inside of us, and some of it is the history of the outside. An intense part of her work was to write of those at risk of being forgotten and without a voice. Some of those were victims of racist violence, threatened with a second annihilation by the oblivion of history. Her understanding of how the I emerges at the dynamic crossroads of multiple layers of history, both collective and personal, expresses the intuition of the non-truly established nature of the I, and turns her over to the poetic task of holding open a space for silenced others to come through and speak. When she unflinchingly gives poetic voice to victims of abominable racist murder, the clarity of her language, her unadorned style, at once both direct and elliptical, challenges the listener, reader in diverse, often uncomfortable ways. Her language art in no way aestheticizes racist violence and its victims, but demonstrates the courage to say that this is a subject for art, for poetic truth without apology. This courageous vision, perhaps fueled in part by anger, who can say, especially now that Clifton is gone, but I would say that its power lies partially in the fact that it confronts without aggression. It is art as an activity of non-aggression, not anger, even if it expresses, quote, palpable rage, as Clifton's editor, Toni Morrison, wrote. CTR explains, anger and aggression are different. If you relate with your anger in such a way that it also inspires a work of poetry, there must be some generosity involved, or at least some kind of awareness. Transcending aggression is the root of all the artistic talent one can ever imagine. Slide. Clifton's poetry often plainly accuses the sometimes willful ignorance of history. And what is history apart from the aggregate of all the individuals unevenly distributed across the landscape of power whose collective story it supposedly recounts? Accusation without aggression, but with the wish to call to account, to awaken the recipient of the poem to our shared history, a history that is not only condemned to repeat itself, but that invites conscious care and a recognition that we are responsible for writing the history of our futures. And perhaps the best way to do so would be by meeting the present moment with the true perception of first thought, best thought. CTR's expansive understanding of first thought, best thought, Lodro, combined with Clifton's insight that poetry is also historiography, can help us understand Simmer Brown's contention that a systematic understanding that addresses our own sociocultural locations, combined with a Lodro practice that encourages us to experience suffering as opportunity, can transform anti-racist work for our entire society. Slide. CTR teaches that aggression is based on wanting to demonstrate, quote, is based on, quote, wanting to demonstrate something that you know, wanting to tell somebody the truth that you've discovered. Although your demonstration might be okay, even fantastic, and the truth that you've discovered may be relevant, the means and the way the whole thing is presented seems to be a problem. For CTR, aggression negates art because it closes down the openness that accompanies truth. And art is not only aesthetic practice, but an entire way of relating to world, to the realm of phenomenal appearances, to you. Quote, non-aggression makes art the art of Dharma, or truth, real art. Such art has a sense of real simplicity without any handles attached. Without any handles attached. Oh, that is the slide. It doesn't seem that this simplicity refers to a particular style per se. If you read CTR's poetry, it ranges from haiku-like compactness to lengthy, rich, enigmatic utterance. This simplicity, in other words, can express itself in both minimalist and maximalist styles, because this simplicity is simply the expression of non-aggression. This simplicity without handles disarms the reader, listener. There's nothing to grasp onto. It potentially exposes us to the unconditioned receptivity of first thought, best thought, if only for a moment. CTR details, non-aggression doesn't mean there's a regulation or a cutting down of anything. In other words, it doesn't mean that there's a tempering or a minimization or a softening. I'll go on with the quote. Non-aggression is seeing through the aggression and realizing there are more ways to be active and efficient than being aggressive. It is a realizing of a new angle of energy. And I'm trying to explore here how poetry can be the realization of this new angle of energy. I know that without reading you some of Clifton's devastating poems, it's difficult, if not impossible, to get to the heart of the matter here. But I see that I've been deferring reading them to you because they present breathtaking violence. Many of you may be familiar with the history of lynching in the southern US, of white mobs hunting down and torturing Black men, and finally hanging them from trees, sometimes burning them alive. What many of you may not know is that these were celebratory occasions, not just the obscene jouissance of frenzied collective violence, but occasions where families might picnic together and the crowds might take pictures of the murdered and mangled bodies with pride, with joy, without apparent shame or disgust or horror. I wasn't sure whether or not to show you one of these pictures, but I think Clifton's poem is visceral enough. It shows you the picture without showing it. It's entitled, slide, The Photograph. Is it the cut glass of their eyes looking up toward the new gnarled branch of the Black man hanging from a tree? A lynching. Is it the white milk-pleated collar of the woman smiling toward the camera, her fingers loose around a Christian cross drooping against her breast? Is it all of us captured by history into an accurate album? Will we be required to view it together under a gathering sky? What is the referent of this photograph? What does the photograph named in the title show? What is it? The poem begins with the question of the quiddity, the whatness indicated in the photograph. Is it the cut glass of their eyes looking up toward the new gnarled branch of the Black man hanging from a tree? Clifton opens by suggesting that the subject of the photograph might actually be the gazes of the participants in this act of violence. And then a single two-word line, a lynching. No question mark, make no mistake, this is a photograph of a lynching, a racist murder. More questions then of what else this photograph might capture, what it might make us see. What is the full picture of this violence? What is the constellation of violence being revealed here? Is it the white milk-pleated collar of the woman smiling toward the camera, her fingers loose around a Christian cross drooping against her breast? The smile, the cross, the breast, all invoked without further commentary necessary. The cutting violence sharpened merely by naming these phenomena. And then perhaps most surprising of all, the final questions. Is it all of us captured by history into an accurate album? Will we be required to view it together under a gathering sky? Clifton's penultimate question may well be a rhetorical one. It summons an us. Is it all of us captured by history into an accurate album? The accuracy of the album, what is captured by history, is all of us. And because poetry circulates without borders, this us includes whoever reads the poem, sees the photograph. Will we be required to view it together under a gathering sky? The sky gathering into storm clouds, or is this a metaphor for that space that can accommodate all of us, with the recognition of an interconnectedness that suggests we all bear the responsibility of witnessing and receiving the pain of the other? Will we be required to? Perhaps this requirement can and should come in the form of rule or law or institutionalization. But the true obligation, the responsibility to attend to the suffering of the other, calls us to account, as ethical philosopher Emmanuel Levinas might say. And is this not also the first teaching of the Buddha, to know suffering, to witness it? And in the Mahāyāna context, does this knowledge not lead directly to the pledge to liberate all from this suffering? This way in which witnessing suffering, knowing suffering, endows us with a responsibility unasked for and unassumed or unassumable is the very starting point of our freedom in the realm of appearances in our shared world. Will we look and come together? Will we look and come together as a we under a gathering sky, or will we look away? This slide. I think I'll skip the detailed explanation of this. But basically, trauma psychologist Judith Herman explained that trauma is not just a individual maladaptation, PTSD, but that rather it's something that's made to appear or disappear under certain social, political, and cultural frames. And she characterizes the symptomatology of PTSD as the dialectic of trauma. meaning that there's an alternation between oblivion, the oblivion of trauma, and the hyper-intrusion of traumatic memory. But what I would have wanted to explain in more detail, and as I've argued elsewhere, is that this dialectic of trauma is actually split up in the social field, which means that the dominant subjects are able to live in the oblivion of trauma. Like, what? There's no trauma. What happened? It's all in the past. Where minoritized subjects deal with the hyper-intrusion of traumatic memory that can happen at any moment. Okay, so I would like to say then that the witnessing function that Clifton has been evoking in her poetry speaks to this split dialectic of trauma. And one could understand the Black Lives Matter movement and the calls to active anti-racism, which it animated, as the necessity of sharing this witnessing function. Can't you see the structural racism? Can't you see that this is our political system, our history? Can't you see your privilege? Slide. So here's another poem about racist murder by Lucille Clifton. Maybe I'll let you just read it. This poem is about the shocking torture and murder of a Black man, James Byrd Jr., who accepted a ride home from 3 white men. The one who invited him, he'd known since childhood, small town that it was. They promised him a drink and took him to a clearing in the woods, where they proceeded to suddenly yell at him in rage, beat him nearly to death, and urinate on him before finally shackling him to the back of their pickup truck by his chained ankles and dragging him a few miles to his death. She names the place, Jasper, Texas, to indicate that this is the responsibility of the entire town. She inscribes the year, 1998, poem as historiography. She dedicates it to the one who cannot speak, who has been violently dismembered. She imagines him speaking through her eye in the poem. Here, there is no gathering sky, but a blistering sun and relentless heat, overexposure, and a dust that covers us all. The head laments in anger, uncomprehending. Why and why and why should I call a white man brother? The townsfolk sing the song of a dream, but can this song bear witness to what was done? Can the townsfolk, can we take up the bleeding hope, recognize that the racist murder of one contaminates us all like the dirt that covers all of us? Clifton speaks directly to the anti-racist force of poetry when she describes a conversation with a white poet friend who heard her read this work. A friend of mine, a good friend who is a poet, who is a white male, was saying that one of the lines is, "Why should I call a white man brother?" That line, my friend said, put him off. You know, it was disturbing to him. And what I asked him was, why when you heard that line did you become a white man? Do you know what I mean? Why did he immediately go to that identity? He'd be angry if I don't know if he would or not, but if I went immediately into the identity of every Black woman, especially since I have a fair idea of how that is defined. Now the way I define it is different from the way you might define it. But he obviously defined being a white man in a way that's a little distressing, I thought. He then said that he also felt bad about that because he realized that he'd done it. And so this was good, that was good, a beginning of wisdom. Slide. The simplicity of this non-aggressive, angry poem without handles penetrated the listener, invoked discomfort, trace perhaps of the arresting first thought, best thought moment, but it was immediately shut down until Clifton could ask her a question. And in this way, the simple exchange that ensued from the poetry reading perhaps provided more clarity and understanding than a weekend workshop on racism and anti-racism could ever have done. I'll skip a little to come to my conclusion. When Black Zen priest and Dharma teacher, Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, calling for anti-racist work in US Dharma Center says, your liberation is on the line, this is what she means, I think, that we're all convoked in our traumatic histories. Liberation is a shared project, inasmuch as the 4 immeasurables, hallmarks of unencumbered, enlightened mind, include each and every being. If I'm only concerned with the positive conditions for my practice and think that the concerns of others in Dharma spaces are not mine to heed and address, then the wish for liberation is adrift. Williams specifies, learn the stories, learn your own. We can't know our own personal minds without understanding the conditioning and the fabrication of that mind. Our social conditions are what make our mind. It's ridiculous to say, oh, that's not the path of the Buddha. Buddha never talked about social justice. The path of the Buddha was explicitly rooted in decasting and declassing. It was so much what he did that he didn't even have to say anything about it. It was all that he did. Close quote. Knowing all the stories, including our traumatic ones, that give rise to the fictional I and sustain it would allow for a true reckoning of this unfindable I, an unstorying to the first thought, best thought, true perception, that genuine art, Dharma art, that is the truth. So this process of analyzing to emptiness the poetic I and the poetic subject is captured by a series of spiritual poems toward the end of Clifton's career that she entitled Meditations on 10 Ox Herding Pictures. They're well-known Chinese images that allegorize the stages of the path. She tells us she never saw the images, but was merely inspired by reading a list of their titles. Her meditations are an exploration of what is this ox and what is the I who wanders. Time certainly doesn't allow for me to read them to you, but I'll just read a few lines. Slide. Man is not ox. I am not ox. No thing is ox. All things are ox. What comes when you whisper ox is not the ox. Ox begins in silence and ends in the folding of hands. The last poem in the series is simply entitled End of Meditation. What is ox? Ox is what? The unending end of CTR's poem, First Thought, connects uncannily with Clifton and leaves us in wondering. The first thought, what was the first what? That what was the best what might not be is heartbroken. Heart is your only security. What shall we do? What shouldn't we do? What did you say? I forgot what I was just about to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Shireen, for this very intense and thought-provoking presentation. We will have discussions later. Right now, we'll take the time just for questions or comments from the panelists.
Just a very small comment. It reminded me of Simone Weil saying that beauty is the perception without attachment. That is beauty. And also James Joyce saying that history is a nightmare that we want to awaken from. And to combine this, the social with the personal perception. I don't know if you can speak a little bit more of what does it look, this perception, this true perception that comes from a place of non-aggression, non-attachment.
I was thinking that. I was thinking that it's such a fraught conversation in the US, but we can think of other contexts, right? Where there's really traumatic histories that it seems like the necessary dialogue is almost impossible due to the intensity of the necessity to speak. And so what I was thinking is that poetry might actually be a better way to come to talk about some of these issues than to have like workshops on anti-racism in Dharma centers or something like that. Because the way that poetry can arrest what we're thinking and what we think we already know, the way it almost doesn't give you time to rely upon your conceptual apparatus, I thought would allow us to break through to the way that the personal is inscribed in history, even if you think it's not your history, even if you think that history is somebody else's affair. So this is why I thought the first thought, best thought approach of poetry might have this kind of anti-racist potency to it.
Thank you. Let's move on to our next presenter. Thank you, Shireen. Yeah, thank you. Our next presenter is Dina Suleimenova. Dina is a fourth-year bachelor student at Rangtung Yeshe Institute. Originally from Kazakhstan, she is a translator of Buddhist literature and medical literature, translating and interpreting between Russian, Tibetan, and English. Dina is also a poet and an artist who participated in the exhibition or participates in the exhibition with her own poetry publication. You can see it in room 104. Her talk today is entitled the form and formless in the acrostic poems of Jamyang Khyentse Lodro. Please welcome her with a warm applause.
So good afternoon. The idea that form comes from emptiness is very strong in Buddhism. And with this, there is a general query of the origin of words and ideas in art, and more specifically in poetry. In my reflections, I seek to compare the philosophical concepts of form and formlessness with the ideas found in the acrostic poems written by Jamyang Lodro. So the form and formless aspects of those poems are explored in the three parts. Next, please. And so it's the guru and disciple, origin and space, and rhyme and continuity. And why I think it's important to look from this perspective is because it's the traditional perspective and the perspective of the text itself. So next, as Khyentse Rinpoche writes in the biography of his master, Jamyang Khyentse Lodro, which is called A Wondrous Grove of Wish-Fulfilling Trees, to dare to speak your name is to limit the infinite abundance of your exceptional qualities. So these lines refer to the reverence to the master, but also they imply that the words are limited to express the inexpressible, but at the same time, there is inevitability of using them to attempt for that anyway. This struggle is not new to either philosophy or art. The ability of words to transmit the inexpressible meaning is especially vivid in poetry. William Mitchell equals the text with the spatial form, suggesting that space and time are interconnected and never static. He writes, space is the body of time, the form or image that gives us an intuition of something that is not directly perceivable, but which permits all that we apprehend. Time is the soul of space. Alvin Rosenfeld explores the existential nature of language and its expression through poetry. He bases his research on the ideas of Martin Heidegger, who wrote, "If it is true that man finds a proper abode of his existence in language, whether he is aware of it or not, then an experience we undergo with language will touch the innermost nexus of our existence." And according to him, poetics, existential ontology, and phenomenology are to be joined together in the study of poetry. Poetry in particular can serve as a special means of transmitting formlessness and finding existence through language. Next. In this context, the form and formlessness are defined based on Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche's explanation of the heaven, earth, and human principle, Namsami in Tibetan. And according to this classification, heaven principle is the primordial mind, free from conditions, which is like open space. If the heaven principle is applied, the work is imbued with sacredness, which is the discovery of goodness, which is independent of personal, social, or physical restrictions. The principles of earth and human refer to working with one state of mind, practicing the Dharma. The earth principle combines the absence of neurotic mind, thorough relaxation and wholesomeness, and absence of laziness, while the human principle it includes the freedom from subconscious gossip and the absence of regret. Applying the latter two principles, the formlessness can be expressed in the form, gentle and genuine. Next. So the first part is the guru and disciple relationship. Initially, I was inspired by the acrostic verses that Khyentse Rinpoche wrote to Jamyang Khyentse Lodro. Khyentse Lama Rinpoche, Kasheme pe damchil madene, Kale gole mitse sedula, Nganye shene, Nyalwa donyere. Precious Lama, listen please, bit by bit, as I felt to think sincerely about Dharma, continuously, steadily, this life of mine is slipping away. Death, it is certain, will bring passage to the house. So the verse consists of 4 lines, each starting with the first 4 letters of Tibetan alphabet. Each line contains the odd number of 9 syllables, which is a more characteristic feature of religious poetry. And the intranslatable opening, Khyentse, is the common opening for many acrostic and other poems, Tibetan. So the guru of Khyentse Rinpoche, Jamyang Lodro, wrote a few poems in this acrostic style. However, he made an emphasis on the end, on the syllable am, drawing the attention back to the origin, the primordial space, free from any constructs. Kandra's abecedarian couplet, despite its simplicity, opens a few relevant topics. Among them, the meaning of guru and death is worth unfolding. So the guru-disciple relationship is central to the tantric poetry. Metaphorically, it is possible to assign the outer guru as the form, while the inner guru as the formlessness to be discovered within our own being. For a long time, could one seek for a guru and perceive guru as someone outside, as if one lost something. However, if the true guru of one's own mind is realized, there is no more need for parting and going. This is the pragmatic aspect of the Tibetan Buddhist literature and practice permitted by the guru devotion. The importance of teacher-disciple relationships is explained by Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche based on the songs of realization of the Tibetan yogi Milarepa. He explains that a disciple goes through the 3 stages of relationships with one's guru, one's own guru. Surrendering one's expectation, learning from a spiritual friend, and finally leaving guru just to discover the teacher everywhere. Why this principle is connected to Jamyang Lodro's poetry is because he often wraps up his acrostic poems with a reference to the primordial sound am. Next. So in this song, advice to the practitioners, after giving as many lines of advice to practitioners as there are letters of the Tibetan alphabet, he concludes, give up in short all unwholesome forms of conduct and meditate on the unborn, the meaning of am. Although the spiritual content is characteristic to all his writings, it seems that the acrostic form is specifically used by the master to remind and bring the attention to the formless meaning, especially contained in the end. Death is considered by Khyentse Rinpoche as a crucial point of life, continuous slipping away. The constant reminder of impermanence, especially of death, is distinctive to the Buddhist teachings and literature. J. Prosser writes that Roland Barthes in his Camera Lucide points to the Western interpreters of Buddhism dismissing the death and emptiness aspects of teachings because they have been caught by the form aspect. Being unsatisfied with the geometry of literature in the West, where the center is loaded with meaning unlike Japanese Zen poetry, for example, where the center is always empty, Barthes finds his flash gap of transcending conceptual experience in photography. The end of Barthes' life was the period of the greatest transformation, led by the desire to return to his mother, both literally and metaphorically. Next. This reminds that the Buddhist wish to return to the mother of all the Buddhas, Prajna Paramita, which is expressed in its most abridged form in the single letter A. Not only do Prajna Paramita sutras refer to the origin of all phenomena, but the text itself has the origin story. It is believed that Nagarjuna brought these scriptures from the Naga realm physically connected to the Kathmandu Valley. Although the mother of the victorious one states form does not come from anywhere or go anywhere, nor does it remain anywhere. Despite that, the origin and location play an important role in the perception of the form and formlessness, and therefore discussed next. So the second part is for origin and location. We all belong somewhere, a place of our birth, the origin of our being, but there are those who belong to nowhere, an existence without a motherland, encircling between, as if in Bardo, the state between death and rebirth, writes the author of the Tibetan suitcase, Shireen. The life in exile of the large part of Tibetan community after the Chinese Cultural Revolution led Tibetans to rethink their identity and literature. The elder generation of those who were born in Tibet but had to live there, homeland includes Jamyang Lodro, who had to pass away in Sikkim without seeing Tibet again. And the new generation of Tibetans born in India, Nepal, Bhutan, and around the globe could reconstruct the image of their homeland, mostly through the stories they heard from their elders. The modern Tibetan poet Sonam Bochung writes about his generation. Far away from the bluest of blue sky and the rampart of snow mountains, we continue to write. And it's clear from his essay that the sense of locality is essential for Tibetan poetry. And the longing for the blue sky grows only deeper in exile. The strong sense of location can be felt in Khyentse Lodro's writings as well. Next. So Khyentse Lodro writes one evening while memorizing the Vajravidarana Dharani, I guessed at Katok Monastery bathed in moonlight. Great sadness overcame me. Again and again, memories of the glorious Sakya monastery appeared in my mind. This is not a Sakya monastery, but it's just a photo of the destroyed Tibetan monastery. And the nostalgia was caused by a sudden remembering of the Sakya monastery from his previous life. Such references to temporality and space resonate with the role of special form literature mentioned above. The strong sense of locality coexists with the constant reminder of the unborn space by Khyentse Lodro. His acrostic praise to the Termi Samvota, the founder of the Tibetan alphabet and grammar, ends in the similar manner. May your wisdom, the vast and born Dharma Dhatu, that holds the meaning of merge inseparably with my own mind. In this way, the form expressed through acrostic structure and the formlessness expressed as coming back to becomes the common repetition in several poems. For the origination of letters from the primordial I, it is probably useful to look at the Mañjuśrínāmasamgīti. Anthony Tribe translated Vilas Vajra's commentary on this work. There he explains that visualized in the Manjushri's heart, the syllable Am is the essence of the perfection of wisdom and the provision of merit and gnosis of all the great bodhisattvas, the sound of ultimate meaning, the cause of all sounds. And in the famous verse, it says that Am is the foremost of all the syllables, the great good, the supreme sound. Tribe mentions two major functions of the letter A. First, being the nature of reality and its origin. And second, serving as negative prefix, it is closely connected to the idea of non-arising found in Prajnaparamita. The idea of the A is negative prefix is reflected in Chögyam Trungpa's poem, How to Know, Know. Next. Yeah. So he writes, there was a giant no, that no rain, that no created tremendous blizzard, that no made a dent on the coffee table, and so on. As the Tibetan script is based on Sanskrit, the idea of the primordial sound A in Lodro's poetry seemed to be primarily based on Mañjuśrínāmasamgīti, the praise of the deity whose emanation he was believed to be. Based on the Indian sources and the indigenous practices of Tibetan medicine and treasure revealing, the Tibetan letters are considered to have some power beyond just transmitting the meaning. Often such beliefs are part of the tantric context, as we have seen the Mañjuśrínāmasamgīti, but also it relates to the syllables of the mantras. The subtle body in Tibetan is La, and it abides in certain parts of the body with the associated sound attached to it. This idea is useful in Tibetan medicine and astrology. Another practical use of letters is found in the Dharmas, sacred texts revealed by Tibetan masters. Francis Garrett discusses in more detail the treasure texts containing the use of edible letters. So in some cases, the embodying of letters can help for diseases and obstacles. As it was said earlier, death is the crucial moment in the Buddhist practice. The reason is the moment of luminosity after death, when a practitioner can be liberated through its recognition. The purpose of the tantric practices is to arouse this clear light of death and once it is manifest, to transform it into a knower of emptiness and so to produce the actual clear light. The mantras associated with the tantric practices are vital in transforming the usual speech in the more subtle, purified form of speech. However, even the everyday Tibetan language is the Dharma-loaded language, where, for example, the body, lu, has the connotation of something left behind. The idea of letters and words being valuable on their own is certainly unique to the usual notions of language, just transmitting the meaning. Next. So the third part is rhyme and continuity. The problematic nature of Tibetan poetic genre is the fact that texts are often a mixture of prose and verse, and the Tibetan verses usually have odd number of syllables for the religious poetry, while the folk poetry verses usually consist of 4 lines, 6 syllables each. And as Vidotov reasonably states, it would be mistaken to disregard the older existing norms of Tibetan poetry. The famous examples of folk poetry are Gisar epics, the songs of the 6th Dalai Lama, and others. The features of Tibetan poetry that can be called indigenous are the images from everyday scenery, such as rivers, mountains, local animals, and melodic rhyme and structure, and the figurative metaphors and repetitions, among other literary tools. So the idea of multiple times that are discussed in Gertrude Stein and Gilles Deleuze can be that the multiple times can be single for the philosopher, is explored in the last acrostic verses, the praise of Tara. This acrostic poem sounds very poetic even for a non-native Tibetan speaker because of its special rhyme and flow. And it culminates in the synthesis of local richness with Indian borrowings, which date back to the early period of the spread of Buddhism, when the esoteric words such as Garuda and Kamadenu started entering Tibetan language and poetry. There are references to Sanskrit and Ramayana, and at the same time, the poem exemplifies a lot of indigenous elements of Tibetan poetry. And when the reader reaches the following lines, it reminds the well-known praise, the 21 Tara. The traditional Tibetan folk poetry verse with 6 syllables is used in this poem, and it's a peculiar choice for religious praise. Many masters, despite their high spiritual status, chose to be closer to their people. The 6th Dalai Lama, Jamyang and so on, is the most notorious example. Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche wrote many poems in Tibetan English and was specifically concerned with making them accessible to the general reader. And the third Karmapa, Rinpoche Dorje is writing, but since the way things are is also endless, I sing songs to inspire others. So they say, in these lines, the idea of formlessness expressed in form is reflected again. So finally, in the end of poem, the offer again comes back to the hard syllable and original. Inspire me with your blessings, O noble Tara, so that with the sound of ha ha ho ho, I may realize the unborn, the meaning of and sum up the recurring motive of realizing the unborn was explored based on few acrostic poems of Jamyang, Khyentse, Lodro. And we explored the 3 main parts of Tibetan Buddhism, characterized by the emphasis on the guru-disciple relationships. And when the true guru of one's own mind is realized, there is no more parting and going. This is like the necessity to come back to the realization of the primordial the inner guru, nature of mind, and all things. Based on the tantric sources such as Mañjuśrínāmasamgīti, explaining the origin and implication of Sanskrit and Tibetan syllables, suggests some sense of grammar with soteriological purpose, which differs from the meaning-based value of letters and words.
you. So first of all, questions or comments from the panelists? Yeah, please.
Oh, it's so tempting just to talk to you. So from what I really love that because I knew nothing about acrostic poetry before you told me all that. So from what I could understand, it's almost like one goes through the acrostic through the whole alphabet to get to the which is the unborn essence, maybe from which the poem even came from. So then maybe it's kind of like the way we have the kind of effortful until we get back to the effortlessness. But I'm wondering if the ka, sorry for my pronunciation, the first letter, like as the ka dak, of Dzogchen is also somehow unborn, or how do you relate that first letter of the alphabet to the last one?
Yeah, I think that is, like you described. But the first letter kaya also usually it's used, the first word used is something like kaya, kadak also. In the acrostic poems, you can see this. And yeah, it refers back to the primordial sound or primordial mind. Yeah, so it's not like only in the beginning there is effort and in the end it is like effortlessness. But I think there is some kind of usage of structure in order to also transmit more meaning than just words. Yeah.
Thanks.
I just, it's Wendelin here. I'm calling from England. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, that's nice. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your presentation. I particularly moved by you talking about the poetry about the monastery. And I just, I wonder when you are looking at the poems, whether in your, whether the sound of the poems bring about a vision of the place in your mind, or whether the poetry for you is more about something that you hear. Because you mentioned about the sounds as being so significant and important, I wondered whether there was a connection for you between the sound and the vision generated.
Thank you. So this is this particular verse. It was about the Jamyang Lodro remembering his past life, as he wrote this in his biography. So he always writes it's like it's just like a dream. So he didn't claim that this is like something real, but he was having vision of his past life in the Sakya monastery, while in the present he was sitting in the Katok monastery. And before that he was reciting the Dharani. And he was, I think, doing all the time the practice. Yeah, so of course it's connected, I think, to the sounds, but
yes.
yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have other questions? Maybe also from our audience here. There's Andrew. Can you give Andrew a mic, please?
Yeah, can you hear? So this is a question. I don't think I hear myself. No, it's on. It just needs to be turned up.
Louder.
I think. Okay. Okay. So my question is inspired by Shireen's presentation, but I would encourage anyone to take a stab at maybe answering it. It's weird that I can't see you, Shireen, so I'm gonna move my seat. You spoke a little bit about the circular nature of suffering as we talk about it as like history repeating itself or samsara. And then yesterday in the keynote address, there was a lot of conversation about things, art arising out of emptiness, and then also like evoking a sense of, I don't know, like non-conceptual wakefulness or a way of relating to it that seems beyond concepts, which was a parallel to how you described the poetry. And so I'm curious about your thoughts about the potential of a circular praxis of mourning, of grieving, of healing, and ultimately of transcendence. Because if we're going to look at, you spoke about poetry being maybe like a good launch point for having the conversation about anti-racist movements. And of course, it can like kind of arrest our concepts in a way that we don't know how to talk about it. But then at the same time, after we experience that, we do need to talk about it. And so I'm curious about what the praxis of moving in and out of that could look like.
Moving back and forth from in and out of
The experience itself of someone else's history, of our shared history, of the sense of I or subjectivity, but then also, I guess, a vaster space of solidarity or transcendence that we do need to experience alongside being able to talk about and move with.
Mhm.
So what does the movement then look like of transcendence within the context of anti-racist movement?
I'm going to just kind of like intuitively jam on what you're saying because my mind is not exactly picking it up. But my feeling is that difficult conversations, like we're already so multiply girded against them, either for the negative or the positive. So the negative is almost don't mourn, organize. So the idea was that if you're mourning, you can't organize. But in this case, it's mourn and organize. So like staying with the discomfort of our traumatic histories and the suffering with the others, being open to that all the time instead of shutting down is what would allow us to organize. So I still don't know if that gets to your question at all, but I would think that for actual institutions, it means that you have to, in a fresh way, always be revisiting what you're doing, and this could be done in, a variety of different ways instead of thinking, because part of traumatic oblivion too is this like, okay, we did that and now we're done. Now we can move on in our institution.
Thank you. So you're suggesting that poetry could be one potential gateway for us to arrive at freshness. And then from that point, any kind of conversation would be more embodied, would be more awakened.
Yeah, or also maybe that like, in a Dharma center, if you want to do anti-racist work, does it always mean having to have a workshop? And also because sometimes the minoritized subject doesn't always want to be in the teaching position. And then the recipient doesn't always want to be in the student position. So if there could be some kind of shared activities, like we're going to read a book together, we're going to read some poetry together, this could get to the heart of the matter in a way that like a discursive workshop maybe couldn't.
Thank you.
Okay, let's have one more question before the break. Please.
Thank you so much. Both of your presentations were amazing. And you both reference actually Chögyam Trungpa's poetry. And my question is for both of you around how you view his contemporary poetry in the West versus more historical poetry that would have been written in Tibet. And do you think, I think it probably has the same point, but if you could just kind of speak about it a little bit in terms of like how you view his poetry in the context of a larger historical movement of Tibetan Buddhist poetry.
I'm going to turn it over to you because I know nothing about the history of Tibetan Buddhist poetry. But I have some thoughts about what his poetry did for Dharma practice.
I cannot answer it like as a very qualified person, but from what I read from Chögyam Trungpa. I think in some sense it looks fresh and something different. Like he wrote in English and he did some new things that no other lamas did, and even some Tibetan lamas have some different views on Chögyam Trungpa, saying that he's breaking the tradition. I think he was doing something what his own lama did. His lama was Khenpo Ganshar, the main one, and his lama was saying that this time is the time of Kali Yuga, and people will not get traditional teachings in any way, like they did before. And his own teacher, he just, I don't know how it happened, but he introduced people, random people, everyone who came to him to the nature of mind. I don't know how it looks. But Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche, I think he tried to do what is the best he could for the modern time in his poetry. But I'm not sure I can answer about Tibetan poetry in a whole.
So then to connect it to also a little bit Andrew's question, because CTR used like this first thought, best thought poetry as Dharma practice for his students and really emphasized the performance aspect. So it'd be like, okay, Meredith, first thought, best thought. And you had to compose a poem on the spot in front of your Vajra family. So that practice was right there to strip away whatever neurosis, as Trungpa would say, and just let you be there with your in that Dharma kingdom. And then going back to Andrew's thing is like, so that this spontaneous practice, the way he taught his students with poetry, then that later got institutionalized into having like, I don't know the exact name, like a department of poetry at Naropa University. So in other words, Rinpoche thought that it was important to teach poetry and the poetics art as part of a Dharma education. So that also gives some intuition about how this practice could be formalized and institutionalized.
We will have our third speaker, Alejandro Martinez Gallardo, with the talk on the importance of beauty for Mahāyāna practice, on the case of Sanskrit Stotras. Alejandro Martinez Gallardo is a graduate student here at Rangjung Yeshe Institute, so many of you know him. His MA thesis is a study of Buddhist stotras and a translation of a series of Sanskrit praises dedicated to Avalokiteshvara. He is interested in Alamkara Shastra, Buddhist Sanskrit poetry, and Madhyamaka and Yogacara thought. He has published articles on the philosophy of attention of Simone Weil and the work of Italian writer Roberto Calasso, among other topics. He has been living in South Asia for the last 4 years, studying Buddhist philosophy and meditation online. Now he's here. He enjoys doing pilgrimage and chanting hymns. So please welcome Alejandro to the talk, The Importance of Beauty for Mahāyāna Practice, the case of Sanskrit Stotras.
Okay, I will be talking on the idea of beauty in Mahāyāna Buddhism in connection to the practice of Stotra. I just have to wait for the presentation. Okay, can you go to the next slide, please? So I will begin with a verse from Dharma Kirti. Vidutta kalpana jala gambiro dharamurtaye namas samanta bhadraya samantas puranatvishe. This verse is a Mangala Charana, an auspicious beginning, but also a stotra, a praise. Most Mangala Charanas are also praises. This verse has been interpreted in many ways. It could be a reference to the Trikaya, and it could be a praise to the primordial Buddha. but let's say it praises Buddha Shakyamuni with one of his common epithets, Samantabhadra, the all good. It praises him for his form, but the features of his form seem to be connected with his wisdom. It juxtaposes the quality of being entirely good with an all-pervading luminosity. You can read the translation there. The word twish, light, can also mean beauty, but is also the case, as is also the case with words like Shubha or Rochana. Light and beauty commonly overlap in Sanskrit and in other languages. Beauty has a glow and is attractive. Light is fair, magnetic, and enchanting. Both are associated with truth, good, purity, and divinity. Most instances of Buddhist practice begin with a verse of praise. A verse of praise sets the intention and directs the mind towards that which is holy, sublime, divine, that which we aspire to become through practice. Stotras concentrate the mind in a virtuous object and inaugurate the process of cultivation. And they do this through the music and meaning of language, the beauty which makes the mind effortlessly attentive by bringing up the energy of desire. Poetry in itself is memorable speech, speech that is worth remembering and easy to remember. Music, when soft voices die, vibrates in the memory, wrote the poet Shelley. Memory, of course, is mindfulness, smriti, having in mind what is essential. Next slide, please. So here you can see a work by Peter Skilling, who has shown that there is a formula to recite stotras in the Mahāyāna Sutras. A praise is also a kind of right etiquette. In Mahāyāna Sutras, when something wonderful happens, or when someone simply wants to address the Buddha, he or she would kneel down, touch the ground with the right knee, and recite fitting verses, verses that fit the occasion. When among a noble assembly, it is right to articulate sweet sounds that have deep meaning. The way to be like the Buddha is by uttering beautiful words. As Mater Cheta tells us, all beauty comes from the Buddha. And the Buddha Shakyamuni himself once praised with a single verse for 7 days the Buddha Pushya, who was doing an incredible feat of tapas. From that praise, we learn, he accelerated 9 eons in the path. There is great merit in praising, but maybe there is also something else. As Dignaga says, the utterance of praise is intended to generate devotion. The state of devotion or faith is the right mood. As that beautiful word prasada suggests, the clarity and serenity that well disposes us towards the path. Furthermore, Vasubandhu in the Abhidharma Kosha tells us faith, in this case Shraddha, is prema, love. And is not love measurable thoughts that leads us into the Brahma abodes beyond the desire realm? Perhaps through the love that beauty engenders, we might be carried away into the divine, free of the net of concepts. Viduta kalpana jala. But perhaps we should not get too carried away with beauty. Perhaps because in Buddhism there are tensions with taking beautiful objects as guides. Mahāyāna also practices meditation on the ugly, Ashubha Bhavana. Here it is recognized that paying attention to beautiful objects engenders desire, but desire that yields attachment, raga, which leads to wandering in samsara. And the partiality for the beautiful seems to be a contrived activity, not befitting of a superior practitioner who rests in equanimity or in so-called one taste. As Diogo Khyentse wrote, beautiful forms are of no benefit to the mind, nor can ugly forms harm it. And yet, Buddhism from earliest times has shown a concern with beauty, which is part of a shared cultural matrix with Indian society. Buddhists were also concerned with kama and artha, but they did this to direct them to moksha. They produced works of kama and of course of Alamkara Shastra, the study of ornaments that make speech beautiful, which is the model for every meditation on aesthetics in India. Indeed, it might have been a Buddhist, Bhamaha, although this is controversial, who gave the locus classicus of poetry, Shabdartau Sahitau Kavyam. Poetry is the coming together of sound and meaning. We find, for example, that one of the edicts of Ashoka speaks of the sweetness of the ripening which will cause the people to regulate their life, and stories in the Vinaya show that rhythmical elements were appreciated in the recitation of Dharma. But this gets elevated in Mahāyāna Buddhism, with its proliferation of ornamented bodhisattvas and so-called celestial Buddhas with their pureness. Or even with its array of marvelously poetic sutras, filled with beauty of body, speech, and mind. Surely there is a reason for all this beauty. Is it not clear that merit is connected with beauty? In the inquiry of Jayamati, the Buddha reveals the secret of beauty to the demise of the cosmetic industry. Those who desire beauty should practice patience, Shanti. In the Jatakamala, we learn that the Buddha practiced Shanti, desiring to adorn the world, and that where a saint lives, the environment becomes beautiful and is visited by deities. There is also the beauty of what we can call the concentration of energy, the glow that arhats and Brahmins share from the practice of meditation or tapas, heat, which makes them attractive not only to humans but to gods, and especially to apsaras, the celestial nymphs. Contemporary monastics also recognize the use of beauty. Samuel, studying the aesthetics of emotion in Sri Lanka, recounts the words of a monk: we have to have a bath, then we have to shave our head and face, then we have to go beautifully in order to attract the people's hearts. Consider this very influential scene of High Kavya from the Buddha Charita. Eager to witness life beyond his palace, the prince, Siddhartha, sets his sights on the world outside. The royal way, the Raya Marga, is arranged. As the news spread of his chariot-bound arrival, noble women haste to the balconies of their mansions, pressed together, the jewelry clinking and shimmering. The poet likens them to a bouquet of lotuses and to heavenly apsaras longing to descend to earth. As they admire the prince's stately arms, as beautiful as Kama, the god of love, the women, full of kindly feelings towards him, offer their reverence. Their desire is ennobled by the knowledge he will renounce and turn the wheel of Dharma. There is a use of sensuality, but it is to lead beyond sensuality. In the commentary to the Artha Vinishchaya Sutra, the divine voice of that of the Buddha is said to produce a rasa that is beyond anything vulgar and associated with desire to be free of samsara, naishkramya. This is the paradoxical virtue of beauty, that it makes one desire to be free of desire. It has the rasa of peace. One full moon autumn, when the jasmines were blooming, Krishna, beauty incarnate, played the flute and aroused in the cowherd woman of Braja the desire to meet God and forget about the world. Perhaps influenced from the scene in the Buddha Charita and in the Raghubamsha, the Bhagavata Purana describes at length the excitement of the women leaving their activities to go see Krishna, rushing to put their makeup, leaving their families unattended. All of them, through the power of Yoga Maya, get to dance with him, he whose body is bliss and truth eternal. Consider also the myth of Persephone, the Greek maiden who ventured into the wild glade contemplating a flower and was abducted by the god of the netherworld, who made her his wife and queen. Beauty was the lure that the divine used to snatch her into the world beyond. The priestess of Eros, Diotima, told Socrates, love is a ladder by which we pass into higher states of contemplation of beauty, from the body to the soul and then to God. These examples speak of beauty as that which arouses love of the divine to attract the mind to God. They are a path through beauty to what they claim is truth. In one sense, it is clear they cannot be superimposed into Buddhism, since they set out from a different metaphysics, or more precisely, they have a substance metaphysics which Buddhism lacks. But there is a similarity in the usage of beauty as a kind of skillful means, or a way to draw the mind towards more helpful objects of attention. We can describe Mahāyāna Buddhism, and this is a definition that I owe to Professor Matthias Albini, as a shifting of attention from more coarse and less virtuous objects to more subtle and more virtuous objects, until the point that no object of support is needed. In the Jnana Alokarankara, Mañjuśrī praises the Buddha as the one who takes no objects, Niralamba, and is beyond mental placement or attention, Amanasikara. At least for us inferior practitioners, denizens of the Kali Yuga, the path consists of attending to kushala, or wholesome dharmas. In the Abhidharma Kosha, wisdom is the analysis of dharmas, dharma pravichaya, so to select correctly the objects of awareness. What would happen if we were to put our attention and desire only on something that is pure, and perhaps even shining with the light of reality? It is here that beauty and poetry can play the part of shifting and sustaining our attention towards the good. Ashvaghosha, at the end of Soundarananda, tells us he has written his poem not to obtain pleasure, but peace. However, he has used the language of kavya in order to capture the attention of those distracted by sensory objects. The work of the poet is like that of the skillful physician who mixes medicine with honey. Poetry also tells us how we should be, but it does it not with the harshness of a guardian, but with the moisturizing juice of rasa, with the sweet and enticing language of a lover. Not unlike the supreme physician, the Buddha, who was also trained as a poet according to the Lalita Vistara, Ashvaghosha also directs all of his work to the eradication of dukkha and champions the rasa of peace. Vamaha echoes him. People will put to use the meaning of a sentence if it is mixed with the sweet rasa of poetry. Children who have first licked honey can be brought to drink the bitter medicine. Another great poet, Arya Ashura, tells us that in the Jatakamala, that by reading his work, those with coarse minds will settle into a serene disposition, a clarity or faith, prasada, and the Dharma stories will become ever more delightful. And he presents the common motif that the outer beauty is but a reflection of the true beauty, which is virtue. Trees are ornamented by flowers. Flashes of lightning are ornamented by rain clouds. Lakes are ornamented by lotuses with their drunken bees. But qualities brought to excellence are the ornament of human beings. Consider now the case of Mater Cheta, the poet who in a previous life was a nightingale that flew into a grove where the Buddha was teaching and spontaneously uttered melodious tones. At which point the Buddha predicted that his future life he would be a poet. Each scene tells us his hymns of praise to the Buddha were like heavenly flowers, and they espoused values that had the dignity of lofty peaks, beauty joined with virtue, sweet sounds and profound meaning. Beautiful speech, as Mater Cheta tells us, without a connection to Dharma, is like iron. The words of the Buddha are like gold. And Shantideva tells us also that in the Bodhicharyavatara, that bodhicitta is like rasa. There is a verse, slide, please. Na shubhashita ratnanam asmi loke sadevake malaya chandana syeva tvad anyatrasti sambhava. Here you can see the Malaya mountain. It's not very clear, but I traveled to Tamil Nadu to visit this mountain, that is also called the Potigai mountain. It's, some people say that this is the abode of Avalokiteshvara. And in ancient India, it was said that the chandana, the sandal, had its origin in this mountain. Like the Malaya mountain is for sandalwood, in the world with its gods, apart from you, there is no other source for the pearls of beautiful speech. Mater Cheta concludes his praise, telling us that the creative intuition that allowed him to conceive his work arises from faith in the Buddha. This suggests that the state of creativity, what in Sanskrit is called pratibha, the shining forward of poetic imagination, is dependent on faith. Pratibha comes from prasada. Only light can give rise to light. Elsewhere he describes what we can call the state of flow. Who that is not omniscient can estimate the Dharma current arising for those engaged in the composition of a praise to the Buddha, when the senses inclined to devotion are melting in each single moment. In this state, with the senses melting from devotion, the stotra composer becomes a vessel for an unfathomable current of Dharma, Dharma Vega, Devotion shifts the mind into a non-conceptual state and allows us to tap into the fountains of reality. Faith is a form of seeing beyond intellect, illumined by love. If I may speculate, we could perhaps say that pratibha draws from the nature of mind, which is luminous and naturally pure. Mater Cheta says that all the beauty of the world is the beauty of the Buddha, who is the purity of the mind, the untouched lotus in the mud. Next slide, please. Indeed, in the Ratnagotra Vibhaga, a famous verse says that one of the four gunas of the Buddha is Shubha, which in this context is translated as purity, but primarily signifies beauty and radiance. And the perfection of Shubha is the fruit of Adimukti, another word used for faith. Perhaps everything is already Shubha, pure and radiant and beautiful, like the wonderful universe of the Avatamsaka Sutra, that in every inch is filled with adornments and Buddha fields. If only we could have the pure eyes of the poet overflowing with bhakti and prasada, we might see this as a pure land, as the Buddha tells Shariputra in the Vimalakirti Nirdesha. It is only because our mind is not pure that we do not see the world as a pure land. But maybe we can use poetry as a stepping stone in the purification of perception. As readers or contemplatives, we can become Sahirdaya, having the same heart as the author. The aesthetic experience is said to be the little brother of the spiritual experience. It is Brahma Sahodara. Particularly Stotras mediate between aesthetics and religion, poetry and prayer, pleasure and devotion. While visiting Nalanda, Itzing noted that the chanting of praises allowed to understand how great and profound were the Buddha's virtues. He enlisted the qualities of chanting Stotras. They show us how to compose verses. They cause the organ of speech to become pure. The chest is expanded. Nervousness in an assembly is overcome. In this one, judging by my nervousness, I beg to differ. And they free us from disease. Indeed, there are many cases of poets, such as Vajradatta and Chandrakanta Vikshuni, who apparently healed through the practice of Stotra. Hamza Stainton sees Stotra literature as the confluence of Vedic hymn and kavya. As is the case with Vedic mantra, Stotras claim to be efficacious language that has blessing and acts upon the world. Praise, writes Gonda, is a turning away from oneself and towards the divine, and a form of truth which should always. The commentators of Mahāyāna speak of the cognition of the ultimate as adarshana or anupalabdhi yoga, the yoga of non-perception. How can we speak of beauty as truth ultimately if in a sense all perception is mistaken? A final remark from Ashwagosha might be helpful. In Saundarananda, Udayin tells the prince he should partake in the pleasures of life, as also the gods have enjoyed before him. The prince replies that he misjudges him. He does not have the contempt for sensory objects. He is aware they are part of the world, but he does not take delight in them because he knows they are impermanent. Although this needs further fleshing out, it might for later non-dual forms of meditation, where appearances are not rejected. Thus Tilopa instructed Naropa, son, it is not appearances that bind you. It is grasping, cut through your attachment. Maybe we could speak then of the beauty of not holding on to appearances, of seeing them as dreams, as the luminous display of emptiness, and still have a form of perception. This I put into question. A perception that is itself divinity, the coming together of Buddhas and Dakinis at the nuptial bed of the senses and the sense objects. But here I have ventured beyond my understanding and into secret territory. Next slide, please. Let us end with a verse of praise that is also a dedication of merit. Here, Nagarjuna, by the merit of praising the one who is beyond the world, hopes that all may become free of the bondage of science. Or we might say, free from perception based on concepts, but not of perfect awareness. Jadava pamaya punyam stutva tvam stutivajanam nimitta bandhana petam bhujatena kilam jagat. Jadava pamaya punyam stutva tvam stutivajanam nimitta bandhana petam gujatena kilam jagat yadavaptam maya punyam stutva tvam stutivajanam nimitta bandhana petam gujatena kilam jagat. Thank you.
Alejandro, thank you for your very beautiful presentation. I also really appreciated that you chanted during it. And I think that's just really part of your argument also probably. So what I'm wondering is what you were getting at toward the end of your presentation when you were invoking Khyentse and beauty is truth, truth, beauty. And then you said, but how can we say that if all perception is, I can't remember your word, warped or deformed or
Erroneous, perhaps.
confused or something. So then I'm wondering if what you're suggesting is that there is the possibility of a kind of non-phenomenal beauty, or like a trans-phenomenological beauty. That would be one question. So it's like a beauty that actually doesn't have anything to do with an object of the senses or even phenomena. That's one question. And then probably related to that, because I don't know almost anything, but I definitely don't know Sanskrit and all of the like terms that are invoked. But I heard you talking about devotion, merit, how praising is kind of linked up with devotion. Merit could be an entry point then into non-conceptual, being hit with some kind of non-conceptuality. And I'm wondering, is there any thought of something like, I want to say the word ecstasy, because like in the Greek, this is something that would take you out of your state. So is there any thought of understanding beauty as a kind of ecstasis or something in this context?
Thank you. That's really good questions. I don't think I can answer them, but yeah, what you say of a trans-phenomenal perception or something like that, that's something that I'm thinking of. Like when I first read some of the Madhyamik Shastras about this notion of non-perception as like the highest cognition, I was thinking, well, how can that look? Because I mean, at the end, there is a kind of cognition because there's wisdom that knows truth, but I cannot imagine how does that look? How can you perceive without a subject, object, etc.? So, I mean, maybe someone here could tell us or help us think about it. It's difficult, but at the same time, there is also these thoughts about perceiving without attachment, right? And if you have like non-attachment, which is like the Naropa Tilopa quote, that somehow there are appearances, but there's not like a self that is like integrating in the same way, but I don't really know. And the second thing, I think it's quite interesting to use the word ecstasy, because it kind of makes us think also of the idea of selflessness, no? Because ecstasy is removing yourself, going out of yourself. So, but there's still something going on, no? You don't, there's consciousness in a way, although it's a different type of consciousness. And I just remember there was a book that I read when I was some time ago, and it was in Spanish, and it said something like to flow, like fluir sin yo, which means like to flow, the flow of the non-I. And so can this be, maybe this like being like enrolled in the dynamics of reality, which can also be said like an adornment of appearances manifesting endlessly without there being like someone attached to the yeah. So just thoughts, I don't know.
Can I put one more, I want to put one more thing on the agenda. Is Khyentse Rinpoche's like recent teaching and insistence, both through discourse and film, that we should not understand the beauty and the magnetism of the Dakini as meaning like a beautiful woman. Like that in fact, many Dakinis might be thought to be conventionally ugly or something like that, and yet their beauty reigns supreme. So I'd just add that to the mix of your thought.
Yeah, and I just want to say about that, like I think somewhere in the talk is there, like the notion that there is some kind of beauty that might not be phenomenal, and in the sense that it's connected to virtue, but also to this, just to like wisdom and love and yeah. So it's not necessarily a sensory beauty. Yeah.
Just something very small to add to this. So probably we have to understand that, especially with regard to this Sanskrit text and the language that is being used, that the idea is in some sense to consciously play with certain contradictions that, you know, just by uttering it are meant, of course, in some sense to go beyond what seems only conventionally to be a conflict, let's say. And also we need a lot of additions on terminology when we think about beauty, and we think about the idea of that we perceive something without sensual support. I mean, the underlying words would just mean without, let's say, a support in the sense of something to rely on. Support always means something to rely on, yeah? And so that things are, you could say, out of and by themselves, the mere experience, you know, would be considered already beauty, probably. And additionally to that, we can also say that there are certain words, yeah? For instance, when we talk about rupa, which can mean form, which also means nature, which actually can also mean beauty. So there is a lot of these kinds of notion that for the reader will automatically be invoked by reading the word. And we have to make, let's say, choices, because in our terminology, these do not overlap and do not play with the same notion. So there is definitely something lost that would need to be invoked by different means, I suppose, in order to capture that.
Just want to say about that. Yeah, I think that is a problem with this. Like the word beauty in the West is kind of like an umbrella term, and we always talk about that. And in Sanskrit, you have many words that refer to beauty, and not one specifically that would be used all the time. And there's actually not a reflection on beauty, but the reflection is mainly on alamkara and on rasa. And so maybe the reflection is mostly on what you could call beautiful speech, or speech that is literary, or speech that is poetry, but not necessarily like beauty of like what are the gestures of the anatomy that make beautiful someone. So it is different, but it also shows us that how important like speech is for the Indian and Sanskrit tradition. That speech and literature is the model.
Okay. Thank you, Alejandro, very much for your beautiful talk on beauty and for the contributions and discussion that we will continue after our last presentation. So let's move on. First of all, a round of applause for Alejandro. And our next and final talk will be by Professor Julian Schott, who has been sharing his research and knowledge throughout the semester. So many of you also know him. I will introduce him, however. Julian Schott studied Indology, philosophy, and religious studies in Göttingen, that's in Germany, Pune in India, and Hamburg. Is that right, this combination? Okay. Like Germany, India, Germany. During his bachelor and master degrees, he studied classical Tibetan at a part-time program throughout 6 years. His dissertation was carried out at and funded by the Center for the Study of Manuscript Culture in Hamburg. It was published in 2019, and it studies the esoteric Buddhist Upper Brahmsha poems of Krishnacharya and its Sanskrit and Tibetan commentary traditions, together with its genre. His study was the first to comprehensively study, edit, and translate one among the major poems of its genre. Currently, he is involved in a couple of research projects dealing with the poetic writings of the Siddha Tilopa, a Shastra on Buddhist cosmology by the third Karma Parangjung Dorje, and a re-edition of Indrabhuti's Jnana Siddhi, but also engaged in interdisciplinary research on mindfulness. So quite a broad range of interests. Today, Julian will share the talk entitled Accepting the Challenge, Mañjuśrínāmasamgīti in Translation. Thank you, and welcome Julian to the podium.
Yeah, what should I say in 20 minutes? No? It's probably a blessing and a curse, you know, at the same time. A blessing because I do not have to talk so much, and a curse because I cannot say what I actually would like to share, you know. So that's, of course, always a problem, particularly when talking about something as vast as such a thing as the Mañjuśrínāmasamgīti, the chanting of the names of Manjushri. The slides for which I hope will appear very shortly. So, I mean, after today's presentations, I actually do not really know what I should add, but a few practical thoughts maybe on what to do with poetry or such things. I mean, you all know that probably anybody who has applied for an Indian visa knows that beyond the 3 lines, it is written Satyam eva jayate, right? Only truth prevails. Maybe we should change this in Kavyam eva jayate, right? Yeah, only poetry prevails, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, anyway, so for whom of you who do not know the text, which I think is not many, so the Mañjuśrínāmasamgīti was believed to be an extraction of the lost Maya Jala in 100,000 lines. It is supposedly an extraction of the 16th chapter, unfortunately lost, only available in, you know, some other realms, yeah, which some might have access to at one point, who knows, huh? Anyway, but I think that these Tantra, I should call it a Tantra, it is listed as the first, you know, in the Tantra section, probably one of the oldest Tantras, incantations, poems, phrases, call it however you like. I mean, it obviously has many categories, right? And I think because of combining all of these features and also because it is that old, it has gained a very high status. I believe it's probably one among the most commented, recited, and actually applied text within the, that's what we could call Indian/Tibetan tantric Buddhist traditions. You can go to the next slide, please. That should be enough. So, and obviously there is many studies and translations of that work, given the importance of it, which is not really surprising, isn't it? So, yeah, I will not bother talking about these. Just go to the next one, please. So the sources on which I base myself are a couple of, I mean, just to give you a range of the possible, let's say, diversity of sources that you have to employ when you want to study such a text. So just basically looking at the poem itself, there is this list of sources, you know, like some from Dunhuang, some from Indian sources, like several commentaries to look at. And this is just like a fraction of stuff that one actually could look at if one wants to study it. And okay, as a small side note, I will go into some technicalities. You might wonder why and what all has this to do with creativity and art, but you know, I will come back to this in the end and present you a conclusion, and then I hope it becomes comprehensible why I'm doing this before, yeah, just as a small side note, okay? Just go to the next slide. So that's just a list of the major commentaries that I found on this text, you know, like in a quick grabbing, yeah, just playing around a little bit and looking what comes up. Probably there is more. I could imagine this. And that you cannot read them actually doesn't matter. I mean, it's actually good that the list, you know, has become so long that you cannot really read the printing. I mean, that makes the point, right? So the thing is here, if we then ask ourselves, you know, what to do with all of that, huh? That's then basically the question I think that somebody has. If you think, okay, I want to study something, I want to apply something, I want to translate it, and then you see there is this, you know, endless list of sources that you could, you know, like look at how to do it. Huh? This is just, you know, a lot of sources, a lot of stuff, and potentially you could say that, you know, like every commentary tradition is valid in and by itself. It presents an interpretation of something that needs interpretation. And then, of course, you could ask, like, is there any obvious starting point? Why to choose one over the other, or why to follow one and to disregard the other? And what is about with possible interpretations, you know, that might be there that actually nobody had really thought of thus far. So there is a lot of, you know, a lot of unknowns and challenges there. Could you go to the next slide, please? So in this I would paraphrase in the following way before a few examples come. So as you all know, the Samgīti is basically, this list of nominal sentences, so to speak. It is, I think, like four verbs in this thing and hardly any grammar, So already this will tell you that it is not exactly clear, how to come up with the meaningful relation of the members of these sentences. And I like to quote Hausmann because I'm a great fan of him, even though it doesn't always make sense to quote A.E. Hausmann, one of the great, English poets and philologists of the old times, just to underline my idea here. So he says, textual criticism is a science, and since it comprises recension and emendation, it is also an art. It is the science of discovering error in texts, and I add, and translations, and the art of removing it. So, and there probably we come a little bit closer to the point, when we already see how much sources are there involved and that the text itself doesn't give us, any structure or whatsoever, then, how to come up with anything, It's obviously a creative process, so it seems. Could you give the next slide, please? And maybe I should also add, in light of the fact that there is the idea of what a translation actually can do and can deliver, although it should, basically, it means the crossing over, right? This is what translation literally means, as far as I can remember. And the crossing over of what, from, let's say, from one sphere of meaning to another, meaning from one cultural sphere with its languages to another. And therefore, what we translate actually should deliver some sort of meaning to the reader. And this is then the sphere where we enter into particular problems, like with tantric sources. So we have this this part of a verse here. Which has a nice tune to it, I believe, if you read it in its original language. And then just look at the last words. I mean, there is many things to talk about, but just the last line, There is the old translation by Davidson who translate 100-headed hala. And then Wayman makes it better, by saying the 100 faces of hala. Still nobody knows what that actually means. No idea what that means. That's what Griffiths, I think, call it Buddhist hybrid English, Isn't it? I mean, what is that? So I try to improve it by translating hala as one of its meaning with poison. But still, this will not do quite the job, I believe. Could you go to the next slide? You will see what I mean in a moment. Hola. Very good. Yeah. That's poison even to the beamer, isn't it? Who would think that? But I can continue to talk a little bit about it. The basic point that comes is that when we look at the work that already was mentioned by Dina, the Nama Mantrata Avilokini by Vilasa Vajra, probably the first commentary on a tantric text ever written, I believe. Quite old, let's say somewhere in the very early 8th century, I guess, something like that. There he does something quite extraordinary. So, like all of these different parts of the padas I was reading out before, they are corresponding to a deity, okay? And these are the deities that are that are the wrathful deities that are surrounding the Vajra Dhatu Mandala and protecting it. So that is what he does in his work, and he identifies each of these words being used there with one tantric tradition where he believed this word is being found. So this you just one small example here. Hala shatanana iti ayam api purvavat vamshtvanyadesha. That just means that it's a dvandva, which means that Wayman's translation is wrong according to him. And then he says hala denotes the Sri Amoga Pasha Tantra. And the same for Shatanana, it's the Sri Vajra Shekara Tantra. So now the question is, if you know these things, if you read it in order, I mean, I study it, I read it in order to translate that verse, can I actually, reflect such thing at all? Is that possible by any means? I believe not. That is not a translation anymore, then it's an interpretation. On the other hand, you believe that is the first, tantric commentary, and we can assume that everybody who ever read this text and studied it and wrote commentaries knows this. So what do we then do with that? I mean, knowing this, how can we reflect such a thing meaningfully? I don't know. Not sure. Probably we can't, I suppose. Could you give us the next slide, please? Here's another one, yeah, just to dwell a little bit on that point. There is many of such points. This is just like, like 2 or 3 tiny examples, okay, of everything that's contained here. So we have this verse, Kulishesho Vajrayo Nirvajramando Napopamach Atchalakaita Jata Popo Gagajat Dharma Patatadrik. And again, yeah, we can see that he identifies these words with a particular tantric tradition. He says that Kulishesha, which just means, well, something like Lord of the Vajra, yeah, that this denotes the Shri Vajrapatala Tantra, and that the Vajrayoni is the Shri Bhuta Dhatmara Tantra. So, and since this is 2 elements, I would think that it's making sense to translate this as 2 elements, yeah? Just a list, right? But what you can see is what previous translators have done. They construe sentence out of that. So Wayman says, the adamantine Lord born from the Vajra, and Davidson, he makes basically an adjective out of these 2 words and says a Lord with his weapon whose source is a Vajra, but it's basically the same. Although it's not entirely clear why you would translate it like this. And, you see, the point is, of course, the translation you see just carries the meaning that, somebody imposes onto the text. It's not at all self-evident that this is the meaning, as you can just easily see by the commentary, right? And so it's not really the point, are they right or wrong, but just more the question like, how can we reflect the potential ambiguity that actually lies there? Because for the Sanskrit reader, it will be totally clear that there are these relations, and at the same time, there are other relations. I mean, I think just by reading it and the sound of it, it will deliver kind of the idea that there is multiple ways of understanding it. You see, I think of it a little bit like an atom before you try to want to figure out where its individual components are, where you locate something in time and space. It's just a cloud of potential, right? Could be everywhere, can be many things. Something like that, probably. Could you go to the next slide, please? So yeah, this is just like a little, thing I wanted to show you on a little bit different level. So you see, like the colors, obviously, they denote the same word here. And there is something interesting that you can notice already on the level of translation. So we have Hahat Taha Nirgosho Vajra Gosha Shadaksharaha Manju Gosha Mahāyāna Das Trailo Kyaravo Mahan Akasha Dhatu Prayanto Gosho Gosha Tavam Varaha. And you can see that we have Gosha, Gosha, Gosha in Sanskrit, yeah, in the first 3 instances. And in Tibetan, we have Chok, Ja, Jang. So 3 different Tibetan words for the same Sanskrit word. And then it continues. We have Nada, Rava, Gosha, 3 different words. And in Tibetan, we have Dra, Dra, Dra. Yeah, so the mess is obvious, isn't it? Yeah. So and then you see that we have, I mean, I do not need to read them all out, but you see that for the rendering of the same word, which can invoke a lot of different notions when you actually read them, right? As all know from whatever language you speak, you will know that one and the same word has a different notion depending on the context wherein it is used. So again, it is obvious which notion that should be when we render it in English. Obviously not, because you can see there is big disagreement. Yeah. So we have noise, sound, laugh, noise, sound, roar, voice, Gosha, untranslated, Manju Gosha, untranslated. It's of course an epithet. It's also not at all clear why it should here be untranslated, although it's a description of qualities. Yeah, so this I would consider a failure. But of course, you can also say I do not translate any of it. Yeah, then you just read it out and be happy about the sound. Yeah, it's also a possibility, probably, right? Yeah, and continue. Sound, sound, voice, sonant sounding voice, sound sounding melodious. Very good. Yeah, so what do we do with that? So obviously there is a big spectrum of what you can do here, right? And well, now comes the question, huh? What do we do? Do we just stop translating because it depresses us that we cannot get at a good, at a good point there, or just we come all up with our own translation? I think that's actually the solution, to the conundrum personally. And this is, let's say, the idea I'd thought I can share with you. Okay, so when you see that basically underlying my presentation and my findings is the study of the text, including many, many of its commentaries and what other people have done, and there is a lot of, let's say, notions that are invoked when I read through the text again after having gone through this process. Whatever I derive at in the end will, for me, be a reflection of this process and invoke all of the layers of meaning I was trying to describe to you, that it's just a fraction of what actually underlies there. So I was wondering if in the end, the idea of that you transfer a meaning which should be the result of the act of translation, if there is not actually the act itself is already the result of deriving at a translation, so to speak. And I'm really wondering if ultimately there is not as many translations, as there are people trying to translate the text, and if that's not, ultimately the meaning of it. Yeah. I do not really have a good conclusion apart from saying something, that sounds already like a little bit worn out, something like the fruit is the path or something like this. Yeah. Or I could say, in my case, the act is the result. I can also come up like with a small verse, maybe. Yeah. Palam eva markam bhavati. I don't know. Yeah. I can maybe compose something small. Yeah. To share with you what I think. Is it, yeah? Maybe the becoming one of the act and the result, is the actual fruit, something like this, maybe I could say. But what I only wanted to share with you, I think, when it's about the act of creativity and art, that I really think that such texts deserve quite a little bit of a different approach, and that maybe here is the forum to share such an idea. I do not actually know where we get precisely with this. I can leave it open. It is more about, sharing what I gathered makes sense in this context and in accordance with what I experienced myself. Yeah? Because whatever you read in the end, it doesn't matter if it's Davidson's, Wayman's, or my attempt. Yeah? You will never read the thought process that is behind my decision of coming up with that. So the question is, how do I share this? And if this is not needed to, to actually translate something in the sense of being true to what the word of translation means, to crossing over and to really give you a sense of what is contained there. Yeah, so probably we can just close with the beginning words. Yeah, I came up with while listening, Kavyam eva jayate. Yeah, so that's it.
Thank you, Julian. And as usual, we start with just a few questions or remarks from the panelists, if there are any.
I feel shy to have more to ask. Thank you so much, Julian. I don't know Sanskrit, even though I studied it here. So I'm super fascinated by what you were saying at the end, because there's the school of translation, which you might guess that I don't ascribe to, which says like, we should try and standardize vocabulary. There is an ideal way to train. Okay, so I'm more on your open-ended idea, but this is going to be hard for me to. So I'm thinking of Jérôme Edou's keynote speech, and the way that he was talking about that the gestural painting is actually the embodiment of some kind of realization. So when I'm listening to you describe finding the right translation after having digested, done all this research, this thought process. At a certain point, to me, it means that having done all of that, then you find a term that's almost like, aha, this is the term that brings together all of that embodied research. So what I'm trying to ask you then is, in the end, what you're trying to convey also to the reader is something that will make them go, aha, with all their layers of what they've already understood. So is that a fair way of it? So in other words, that we always think that Dharma teachings are aimed at people with different capacities in different locations. And maybe we hadn't thought of translation that way, but is that why there's so many different kinds of translations needed and necessarily?
Yes. I think that how to phrase this good. Like people talk differently, different times, different areas, and there is no obvious reason, like why should one translation do the universal job where it was not even possible that people within like two valleys communicate properly with each other, right? So given that fact, it seems that virtually every group or generation, they will need to come up with a version that delivers the meaning in the way that they find suitable. And on top of this, like I was trying to express also, there is no obvious reason why you would prefer one interpretation over the other. And we can see that different schools interpret things differently in their own way with their own terminology. So why should one version do the job? So this is why I actually think that that the process in some sense is more important than the result, simply because the process, everybody who is undergoing this process and then reading the verse, yeah, I mean, this is something that I ask my students to do. Huh? So read the whole work. When did you the last time read an entire work that is written, in verse? It is meant to be recited. It is meant to be sung. It is invoking, feelings by sound, yeah, and then to rest in this and see what it does to you, after it has been explained to you by many, many people, different facets, different layers. You did your study, and then you read through again, like in a quiet moment with yourself, just read it, for the sake of the experience. And this is certainly part of the meaning that is never addressed, when we dissect it like, like medical or biological students, a dead frog. Huh? Yeah.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Julian, for your talk and for the thought-provoking question. I will now present my response, and that will hopefully open the floor for more engaging discussions. Okay, so the 4 papers of this panel took us into the realm of language, poetry, and translation. Buddhists have an ambivalent relationship to language and to beautified language, such as poetry or song. One of the 10 vows of a Shamanerica precepts forbids Buddhist novices to engage in singing. It is seen as a distraction from learning to control your mind and thus from achieving awakening. However, Buddhist meditators since the very beginning have composed poetry to express their experiences. Indian tantric masters have sung songs of experience. Pujas, stotras, and sadhanas are chanted. A sheer infinity of tantric songs remind us that ultimate reality is beyond language, ineffable, and yet the gurus seem to be unstoppable in producing more language. The speakers have elucidated aspects of the creative process of composing language from various perspectives and brought valuable questions to the discussion in relation to the Dharma or Buddhist studies. For example, what makes any composition a piece of Dharma art? How can language contribute to liberation? Or in academic lingo, what is the soteriological purpose of creating poetry? Besides being truthful, does the composition of Buddhist verse or translation need to be also beautiful? Is it not enough to be true? In the first talk, Shireen Patell led us to the question of how you can transform anger, deep-seated anger, the source of suffering. Her answer, inspired by the poet Lucille Clifton, is you can transform anger through non-aggression. Non-aggression is what distinguishes Dharma art. In Chögyam Trungpa's words, non-aggression makes art the art of Dharma, or truth, real art. How then do you bring about this non-aggression? Shireen suggests Lodro as an answer. She leaves it up to us, readers and listeners, to figure out how this Lodro would have to be trained. Lodro, generally speaking, means mind training, and more specifically refers to contemplative practices geared towards developing bodhicitta, a combination of wisdom, loving kindness, compassion, intention, and motivation. To foster non-aggression, so Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche, there must be some generosity involved or some kind of awareness. Which type of awareness would that be? An awareness that dissolves the boundaries between you and me, an awareness that emphasizes connectedness of beings rather than differences. Or an awareness that dissolves the boundaries between guru and disciple, as we learn in Dina Suleimenova's presentation on Jamyang Khyentse Chodo Lodro's poetry. Dina explored his acrostic poetry as the skillful ways of a guru instructing their disciples. This is the soteriological purpose of language and poetry. The guru uses poetry as a more powerful vehicle than prose to convey the Dharma. Dina analyzed the interesting form of acrostic poetry, meaning alphabetical or abecedarian poems, in which each line begins with a letter in the order of the alphabet. This poses, of course, a dilemma for the translator, because in English, the alphabetical order is lost or is different. Yeah, we have A, B, C, D, and then in Tibetan, we have Kakaganga. I would be curious to hear whether Dina has insights on how to render the beauty of acrostic poetry into another language. Have you ever tried an acrostic translation? The Tibetan alphabet does not include the vowels, but the letter A, seen as the origin of all vowels, is sometimes added at the very end of alphabetical poetry, Dina told us. This is how Jamyang Khyentse Chogi Lodro concluded many of his poems. The letter A expresses the unborn ultimate, in which all differences, all words and actions dissolve. The guru instructs the disciple to remain in that space. The guru's instructions are more powerful if they are conveyed in beautiful language, Alejandro told us. He argues that, based on his very interesting research on Sanskrit stotras, or praises. Beautiful poetry uses the magnetizing effect of language to draw people towards goodness and virtue. And vice versa, beautiful language creation emerges from a mind that is connected to virtue, purity, and merit, from a mind that is enhanced by faith. Beautiful poetry is what heightens awareness in daily life. Alejandro told us of one of the functions of reciting religious poetry, and he performed that also. One of the functions is recollecting the Buddha, Buddhanusmriti, keeping his awakened qualities in mind. I remember reading Chögyam Trungpa's autobiography about his early experience with poetry. He told that he was so enamored in love with poetry that he would compose verses constantly. Even when he had to write a simple note to his attendant, he would compose it as a metered verse. This is how Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche would bring beauty into all moments of life. Alejandro skillfully weaves together an analysis of beauty and the energizing effect beauty has on our lives. He says, love is giving energy to someone. He quoted that from Tinle Norbu Rinpoche. That someone is, first of all, the poet himself, herself, I would argue. And then Julian finally comes to the conclusion, comes to the difficult question of how to render the beauty of poetry of one language when translating it into another language, which is constructed of very different concepts, such as in the case of Sanskrit, Tibetan, and English, as we just saw. Is there such a thing as a perfect translation? We would all agree that there cannot be. However, why is it worth trying to find the perfect translation nevertheless? Julian argued that the value emerges from the process. He started with the premise that the value of translation derives from the truthful rendering of the content, while outer form is secondary. He does not say it in these words, but this is somehow how I understood the approach. The process of expressing poetry, such as the Mañjuśrínāmasamgīti, in English language obliges the translator to delve deeply into the verses and consider various possible interpretations, thereby opening the numerous meanings of the text. Julian explained to us the creative process of a translator, which is where liberation through language lies. The published book that stands in the shelf at the end, that is a mere byproduct, he provokingly told us. In some sense, all 4 presentations looked at language compositions as a form of process, rather than a product. Language in general, and the beautified language of poetry in particular, enable processes of connection. Connection with others, with other beings, pain and guilt, and thereby heightens the reader's awareness of their own pain and guilt, as well as their own virtue and purity. In this way, poetry is skillful awareness making. Poetry is skillful awareness making. I'm ending here with such an awkward word, not very beautiful. So anyway, skillful awareness making. So thank you. And we need a mic into the crowd. And while you're handing out the mic, I will give the opportunity for the panelists to maybe address 1 or 2 of the questions that I brought up, if you like. If you don't, we move on.
It's awareness in the making, right? Or not?
Yes.
It's a good compound. I like this. It's nice. Oh.
I really love the way actually that you synthesize what seems like disparate presentations. I wonder though, in Clifton's case, because there's this kind of historiographical urge, or impulse animating some of her poetry, the process is certainly important, but in some way the product is extremely important. So in the poem about the lynching, even though she invites us to this further reflection with all these poems, questions. It was important to say a lynching. What is being shown or talked about is a lynching. Or in the other poem, there's can be all this reflection invited, but what is being shown or what is being told about is a racist murder that happened in Jasper, Texas, of James Byrd in 1998. So there, I think that it's almost the other way around, going through her process to make this product then brings the reader and listener into a new process of trying to take in this new understanding of who they might be or something like that.
And so the poems translation, it was done by Adam Piercy, for example. And yeah, the poems that I was talking about, they were already translated by Adam Piercy in the English Bicedarian style. So I just forgot to mention it, but about other poems, it's not so common to translate them with the English ABCD order. I don't know, I have the same maybe thought as Julian has, that translator or I don't know, the poet has personal research and then reflection. So I don't think it's necessary to translate in because Tibetan and English alphabet are not really equal, but it depends on the meaning, I think. Yeah.
Okay, I have a question. It's turned on, but it's on, but it'll never be on. I don't know if this- Yeah, I had a question for Alejandro. I came up with Alejandro's presentation, but it would be cool if anybody and everybody answered. What draws you to beauty?
Is this on?
No,
Funny
here,
question.
here.
Okay. Well, that is one of the things that I kind of reflect in the paper in the longer version. There is this phrase by Shakespeare, like fairest creatures with desire increase. Like, so I think it's kind of natural. What draws you to beauty? Like we are drawn to beauty, and this is like kind of unexplainable. Like from like a biological sense, we're drawn to beauty, like peacock's feathers, whatever. Like we're drawn to beauty. You know, like there is like a biological component in a way, But I think one of the biggest reflections that I kind of try to make, not successfully perhaps, is that we're drawn to beauty, but is beauty drawing us to somewhere else because it's true? Like it's like a glimpse of something beyond, or that true appearances is calling us to some type of truth. So in that way, like one person would be drawn to beauty because he's drawn to know himself, to know reality, to there is something more. Like for example, I think the Greek word for beauty, which is something like kale, I don't remember exactly. Yeah, it means well, it means calling. Like beauty means calling, actually. Like which is I think quite interesting. Like beauty is calling itself. Like what draws you to beauty? Well, beauty is the calling. Yeah.
Yeah, what draws me to it, I guess, is the nature of it, huh? I mean, why would you? I mean, what draws you to something you like? Obviously, the fact that it's nice. You like it, it inspires you. Probably you could say the simplistic elegance that maybe lies beyond mere form. When we talk about appearance, there is many things, but ultimately it will come down to the fact what beauty means for you. Yeah? So I cannot answer this to you unless we have, let's say, our Hegelish awakening that everything is in some sense bound by the context within which, like we operate, yeah? At least as far as we use words. And what I suppose draws us all to poetry is the fact that what is skillful about it is that, it's like what is skillful about Buddhism, that Buddhism is a deconstructivist who constructs something, a system that is meant to overcome itself when you successfully apply it. So that's in some sense you can say very skillful, and the beauty of it is obviously like the moon, the finger pointing to the moon but not being the moon itself. No? That is something that's skillful. Like you use something that is so limited in order to show something that actually seems less limited. Huh? And isn't that in itself a fantastic thing? I mean, that is what I would think about poetry personally. You're not.
I guess I'm thinking that Lucille, once again, provides an interesting angle of insight into this question about beauty. Because, I mean, definitely her poems, her language art is recognizable as poetry. I think we would say this is poetry. So in that sense, like poetry might be part of an aesthetic project. Would we ever use the word beauty to describe the two poems that I've shared with you? I don't know. But because it puts us face to face with confronting something like the truth and the whole, now I'll use it, the whole beautiful suffering collective of humanity, then maybe there's some kind of beauty. But so I think we can think of the force of poetry as something that also has some kind of strange beauty to it. It doesn't have to be aesthetic as being like a beautiful aesthetic object.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's relevant, but yeah, I was watching the discussion about the poetry of Rumi and Rilke. And there is a lot of sense of like longing for something good inside, for some kind of also maybe beauty or goodness. And this is like evidence for this kind of goodness or God inside your own being. And I think in Buddhism, it's also the same idea, like we all have Buddha nature, and the sign is the kind of longing itself, not just some kind of other signs. Yeah.
Can I just add something quickly on Julian's? Because you said that Buddhism deconstructs itself or goes beyond itself like a skillful way, no? This reminds me, like one of the ideas I wanted to present was that in other traditions, you have, for example, Krishna, who is absolutely beautiful, and his body is truth. Like, there's nothing beyond that. Like so, yes, he is skillfully drawing people into truth, Dharma, whatever. But that is all you get. Like it's not like the same as, for example, in Buddhism, that you could argue that okay, the body of the Buddha is like the raft that you use, or the Dharma is the raft that you use, but you drop that. There is this image in Platonic philosophy of a ladder of love, right? But here you would leave the ladder. Like there's not a consistency, perhaps, and that's a question. There's a correspondence, like in other religions, there is a correspondence between beauty and truth. And in Buddhism, I'm not sure, maybe, perhaps if you go into like Vajrayana and pure appearance, etc., but certainly not necessarily in other forms. So I think that's an interesting question.
Thanks. I just wanted to bring in my thoughts about what you just said. Yeah, are Lucille Clifton's poems beautiful? I thought that is what you were describing as non-aggression in poetry, the Dharma art. Yeah, the fact that she manages to put something so horrific as this lynching into words that, in a way, are presented in a beautiful form, and therefore that makes it possible for the perpetrators, or all those who are somewhat connected to the perpetrators, to listen even to that poem. Otherwise, the pain and the guilt would just be so overwhelming. So therefore, yeah, there is some beauty in it, no? Could be. Yeah.
Thinking about Julian, you said something like beauty is nice. Like we have to think about why we like it. I'm just happy that Shireen brought up the examples of the poetry that share, because it seems to me far from nice, to hear and read those things. And yet there still is some sense that it's quite beautiful. Like it brings tears to my eyes to think about that, and to drop the thinking, especially, and to feel it. And I was thinking also about the notion of like a siren song, the way in which we're drawn to something and maybe called by something that's seemingly beautiful. But the approach with which we relate to the beauty is then, I think, what defines like our experience of it. Like as soon as we want to know exactly what it is, we want to pin it down, we want to own it and possess it, we hit the rocks and we die. Yeah, at least in this example of the siren song. And so something about the connection between beauty and truth, but also this truth as something that's inconceivable, and the way in which we relate to it being something that is beyond just a need to proliferate the sense of self, that can understand things and concepts, and that needs to understand something in order to fully experience it. It seems that everyone is able to experience beauty even without understanding it, and maybe it actually precludes the inability to understand.
Nice was just the first thing that I thought about, and then of course it comes pretty much down, when we're in this realm, to how we like to define it. I mean, maybe we are speaking about the same thing without knowing it, maybe not, who knows. Yeah, I mean, well, we haven't precisely exchanged our ideas about what the words mean. It's difficult to tell, huh? Isn't it? So but this is why I think I said that, I have this idea that the beauty lies in the elegance and in the certain sense of simplicity. And that is for me something that to experience I could describe as something that approximates to what I connect with the word nice. Yeah. It does not necessarily mean like nice in the sense of, oh, like that's a nice salad, you know, not like this. Yeah. But more like, oh, wow, that's a nice in the sense of, oh, wow, that's a very interesting experience, you know. Maybe then it works better for you. I don't know, but this is more what I had in mind. Yeah.
And I'm thinking as people that are all interested in the Buddha Dharma, that we also have to think about the attraction of samsara or the attraction of suffering itself. And so then we could also say that there's also a fascination with what is disgusting is not only repellent. I mean, we can just see pop culture lives off of the attraction that one has to horror and trauma and violence. And so I think that attraction to suffering, so like not knowing suffering, but just the magnetism of suffering itself, has something to do with us wandering around in samsara. So I can't say more than that, but we'd have to add that into the mix too.
Yeah, I would just say quickly that yeah, one of the points that I think that you can use beauty, and it's probably there in like the Indian Shastras, that it can kind of educate the mind and educate desire, right? Because in a way, we are drawn to certain objects, but it's kind of because we inherit kind of, as you say, some like traumic or some idiosyncrasies or some fields of morphic resonance, you could even call it, of being attracted to certain objects or certain type of objects of attention. So kind of one of the uses that I think that poetry, perhaps this sounds very highbrow, I don't know, but I think it's true that we can use poetry to educate attention and desire. Like, for example, instead of being in TikTok or whatever, and like reading, I don't know, Keats and Yeats, whatever, it's kind of more ennobling, and the mind learns, and then perhaps we're not so attracted to lesser objects, we could call it. And that is kind of what the Abhidharma says, right? Like we should train in kushala or dharmas that are anasrava. So I think it's a way to go, yeah.
I wanted to bring somebody into the conversation. Because during the public talks, we invited Arawana Ayashi, who is born in the States, but from Japanese descent. And she's also a student of Trungpa Rinpoche. She works in what she calls social presencing. So she's using movement and bringing sense of awareness of the impact we have on each other just by being present in the same room. And that the awareness of that being kind of the path for the kind of changes we want to happen in the world. And I think Shireen's talk is very much about that. And she defined, to start with her talk, she defined the aesthetic in opposition to anesthetic. So what is beauty is the fact of being touched. So whatever is touching has a sense of aesthetic in opposition of what kind of dulls us out and brings us to a sense of anesthetic. And so it leaves out the kind of beauty that is kind of idiot compassion, as Trungpa would call, and bring us in a really kind of immediacy of how the world is touching us in the moment. How all of us sitting in this room is being impacted by everybody else. And this in itself creating the reality we are working with. So beauty could be working with that in that way.
What was her name?
Her name, Arawana Arawana, I think, Ayashi. And you can find her talk on our SoundCloud. And I don't know if we filmed it, but it might also be in the YouTube. And she also wrote a book called Social Presence.
Do we have other questions from the audience?
This is such a great conversation. I think what you just brought up really brings some insight into what Shireen just said, because Shireen was talking about how, and I was thinking about this as well, that, you know, there's so much about the unattractive and the repulsive that we are attracted to. And that, like, we are attracted to truth and beauty, but we're also attracted to, like, as Andrew said, insanity, you know, the siren song, like bringing us to crash on the rocks. And thinking about that and thinking about what you just said, that like we have to be touched by social presencing, and to be touched by something means that it's beautiful. I think is also like bringing in another dimension to the conversation where it takes out necessarily like the subjectivity of like what I think is beautiful versus what you think is beautiful, just to be able to give this blanket answer to Zach's question of, well, whatever you are touched by, that is beautiful, whether someone else considers it beautiful or ugly, doesn't matter. And like to Shireen's point, you know, maybe we're not necessarily touched by what we find repulsive, we're just attracted to it a lot of the time, you know, like you know, Clifton's poetry, that touches you. Whereas, you know, watching, you know, a documentary about the murder of a family may not even touch you. It's just you're attracted to the repulsiveness. So I do have a question for the panel, and that, do you think that in the context of Buddhism and poetry, does it have to be beautiful to be meaningful? You know, do you think that meaning is inherent, is synonymous with beauty? And that, I think, comes in the question of, Rinpoche is always talking about how, or in the Buddha Manyamaka, we're always learning about how either you're attracted to something, or you're not attracted to something, or you're indifferent to it, you're repulsed, you're attracted, or you're indifferent, right? And so does something have to be beautiful to you as a Buddhist reading a piece of literature for it to be meaningful, and for you to find practice in it, for you to understand the Dharma? Or can it be less than beautiful? Does it? That's the question.
I would like to say something to that, because I think that particularly in the tantric context, there is something interesting, that they make language, you know, kind of ugly, just to break with the convention. And that is obviously a teaching in itself. You know? So that is really depending highly on the context, right? I mean, that they would even compose in a way that is non-standard or breaking rules, you know, just in order to show other people that they don't care about it. You know? So, and then you can ask yourself again, like, is this sense of being progressive, which certainly it is it not in itself has its own, let's say, touch of, let's say, something that's, you know, like thought-provoking? And even there, I mean, you could say, isn't a really good joke has also maybe a certain sense of beauty, although it might not be the first word that comes to mind. But thinking it through, I really think it is an interesting question. But certainly there is a lot of things that, you know, many traditional scholars of the time would have not, definitely have not considered to be beautiful. And that was precisely the point to make. You know? And there is certainly a lot of meaning in it. Just to answer this question directly with one example.
Well, but I would say beauty is important, as we heard in many examples. It is a powerful, skillful means in order to draw people towards the content. You could say the content in itself could do the job, but in addition, having the beauty of, for example, the language has definitely an impact. When we look at the history of Buddhism spreading to China, we are told, at least by the scholars who look more deeply into those translations, that Kumarajiva's exact translation was superseded by Xuanzang's not so exact but more beautiful translation, just because it is what people touched. Yeah, when the heart is touched, then that has a power and a virtue in itself. So therefore, I would say beauty is important.
I think, I mean, as I think as yesterday, is it doing it? I think as Julian was saying before, or we were all suggesting, probably depends upon the definition of beauty. The one that Diane put on the table is very helpful. But now we can also understand, think about the prevalence though of violent rhetoric in texts of awakening. So, you know, devotion pierces your heart. The guru is the one that points out your hidden faults. The practice of Dzogchen has to do with cutting through. Chö has to do with cutting. So there's also a violent kind of rhetoric that, so I think if we bring both sides together, whether you're being touched or you're being hit or you're being pierced or you're being cut, the idea is you're being opened. And so whatever it is that opens you to something to which you're unaccustomed, I mean, that's probably the force of poetry. I mean, there may be soothing kind of poetry too. I bet I'm not the only one who likes to indulge in a good evening of sad songs, but whether those are going to lead to my awakening, I don't know. So, but I think just being opened, whatever it takes to open us, you know, that's beautiful.
Okay. I see also Chamba. We haven't heard from Chamba.
When she said
Yes.
touched, she said the second word was feeling. So something that makes you feel.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Working? It's on, it's just fine. Hey. Hello. Working?
Yeah.
Okay. It's not online for the one. First of all, thank you very much for the centers. They're beautiful. And I really appreciate it. And I don't know whether this will be a question or no. I was wondering about the kind of the definition of poetry in maybe in Sanskrit literature. So, well, question
Awesome.
to Sanskrit scholars, and in Tibetan, the poetry, yeah, it has this. I mean, poetry contains both bodhi and Dharma content, contents, but mostly Dharma. And then poetry is many times the expression of the ultimate truth, the reality, and also beauty of compassion, wisdoms, and the Buddhist so forth. And then the term, looking at the Tibetan term, poetry, Nyinga, actually is a synonymous to Jamyang or Mañjuśrīn. You know, Nyinga is it means melodious speech, right? Then Jamyang is also the, and then what Jamyang is, how to translate Jamyang in Tibetan?
Sweet melody or something like this.
Gentle speech, right? Gentle speech. So in a way, poetry in Dharma sense is, wisdom. It's an expression of the wisdom, ultimate truth. Yeah. So I wonder if that is the thing in Sanskrit literatures. And that's the kind of question. I don't know whether that would be a question.
Go.
And and another thing about beauty, I agree many of the things you have said about beauty. And then from very kind of Tibetan literary point of view, I think beauty, we can look at it from two truth point of view. The ultimate truth
point of view, then beauty is, the truth, the ultimate reality. In an expression, we can say how beautiful, how truthful it is, the reality. And the word, Tibetan word for beauty, there are several words for beauty, but one of the main words we use for beauty is zedu. And there's two syllables, ze and du. Ze is kind of, the ecstasy, the beauty, and the du is suffering. So then in itself, the concept of the beauty in itself carries the reality of both suffering and then ecstasy. So it's kind of, the beauty means just in a way reality, the suffering and as well as this peace. So I wonder, that's the case.
Yeah.
Beauty.
Well, Champa, thank you. I think that's very interesting and might speak of how in different cultures there's different understandings. But I mean, in the Sanskrit tradition, Bhamaha defines poetry as the union of meaning and sound, Shabdartau Sahitau Kavyam, which kind of means, I would say, like beautiful speech and words that have meaning, profound meaning, or at least they're very inventive. But there are other definitions. I'm not I do not know so much to tell you, but there's these debates about what is the actual object of poetry, and normally they say that it's pleasure more than, for example, Dharma. No? In the Alamkara Shastra, in the Rasa discussions, so it wouldn't be exactly the same. I would think this is more like some type of activity that has to do with pleasure and kings, etc. But at the same time, you have poets like Ashwagosha, etc., who say that they write for Shanta, for the rasa of peace. So they are actually doing what you would be saying, like in the Tibetan tradition. And just the final reflection is that it's quite interesting what you say of beauty having this awareness of suffering. And there is this notion, I think, of beauty, the beauty of impermanence, right? Like this notion of appearances arising and ceasing. And that could be a way of also understanding beauty as that we do not attach. There's Simone Weil, the French mystic, said that beauty is the perception that perceiving something without attachment. Just that is the beautiful thing, because we always bring something into our perception. So if we can perceive without bringing anything, that in itself might be beautiful.
I guess that the context are different because in the Indian sphere the context is vaster. Obviously, there, like Sanskrit poetry has had many other objectives, as Alejandro described, than talking about the Dharma. On the other hand, you have to see that the mastery of language was always considered to be a certain sense, or containing a certain sense of realization in itself. I mean, look, for instance, at Kalidasa. He is even contained, in some versions of the Tengyur, yeah? And Kalidasa, obviously, was one of the most famous poets, has nothing to do with Buddhism at all. So you can ask yourself, why is that? Yeah? Just because this beauty of language, this mastery of language, expressing all the possibilities of let's say, mastery that are possible, like bringing it to the limit, like goes beyond something that's just worldly. So, and that in itself is an accomplishment considered to be of such great extent that it deserves recognition just for the sake that it exists, so to speak. Yeah. So I do not really know how this fits there, but then of course you can ask yourself, like, there is also a very famous definition of what Dharma is. Yeah, basically whatever tells you something true about the nature of phenomena. So by definition, you could say this definitely also goes beyond Buddhism. Huh? So in some sense, you can ask yourself, like, depending on with which definition you operate, where are precisely the boundaries? No? And this is something I suppose we have to negotiate. No?
Oh, yeah. This reminds me of last time Rinpoche's teaching on Mañjuśrīn. And he was teaching Mañjuśrīn in three kind of, category or three different ways. First is, the legendary Mañjuśrīn, and then figurative Mañjuśrīn. And then Mañjuśrīn is Mañjuśrīn as the truth itself. It doesn't have to be really, the truth from, Dharma's, expression, Dharmic expressions, the truth of the reality, the cosmic, truth itself. He said even, some chairs or some beautiful seat could be Mañjuśrīn too, as long as it's, kind of reminds you of the truth. Truth being, things are not, fully established. So he was just giving this specific, the examples. So in that sense, Mañjuśrīn, we don't really have to kind of understand it in a very, very Buddhist kind of, the context. Mañjuśrīn also represents the truth itself, truth of the reality.
I think these are wonderful final words. Sorry, we are out of time. Of course, I invite you all to continue your conversations privately or tomorrow. I would like to thank the audience for this very engaging way with the presentations.
Yeah.
And of course, most of all, I would like to thank our scholars for their excellent, fine presentations, thought-provoking, deep. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. And that's it for the day. See you all tomorrow.